Fears of catastrophic flooding in southern Ukraine as a dam collapses, putting thousands at risk. Evacuations underway as Russia and Ukraine blame each other for attacking the site. Protesters out in the streets of France once again in a last-ditch attempt to persuade the government to change course over its unpopular pension reforms. Our reporter Karis Garland is at the Paris protest. And Prince Harry becomes the first royal in more than 100 years to give evidence in court. King Charles's son is suing a British tabloid publisher, saying his life has been marked by relentless media intrusion. Welcome to the programme. I'm Nadia Massi. Our top story. A major civilian evacuation is underway in southern Ukraine after Kyiv and Moscow accused each other of blowing up a key dam on the Dnieper River, triggering catastrophic flooding. Footage circulating on social media shows much of the dam wall being washed away and a surge of water heading downstream. In Ukrainian-controlled territory alone, some 16,000 people are thought to be at risk. Now, Kyiv says it is investigating the apparent attack as a war crime and as ecocide. So what do we know about the dam itself? Andrew Hillier has been taking a look for us.
The Nova Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine lies some 30 kilometers east of Kherson. It crosses Ukraine's mighty Dnieper River, holding back 18 cubic kilometers of water, sitting 30 meters tall and spanning hundreds of meters. The dam's destruction could have huge consequences for the wider region, starting with towns downstream. Water levels are already rising fast. Emergency officials say they'll keep rising for a further 72 hours before subsiding. They've issued dozens of evacuation orders. Further upstream lies the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Water from the reservoir behind the Nova Kakhovka Dam is needed for the plant's cooling lake to operate the turbines. The International Atomic Energy Agency says it's monitoring the situation, but that there are no immediate safety risks. But the dam's destruction is a huge blow to Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It's also a major hydroelectric power station, and now some 3 million homes could go without electricity. Also at risk, Crimea's canal irrigation system. The North Crimea Canal delivers water to Crimea from the Dnieper River. It accounts for some 80% of Crimea's water. The dam's destruction could wreck the system of canals, threatening 120,000 hectares of crops, which rely on irrigation.
Well, also covering this story for us today is our foreign editor, Oliver Farry. And Oliver, just bring us up to speed then as to what the latest is in terms of the damage at the dam and the flooding.
Well, the damage has been fairly substantial. About 16,000 have been immediately affected, but it could indeed be more. We do not yet know, indeed, how far the flooding caused by this, the dam breaking, how it has reached. We're not even sure, actually, what has happened with it. We know that the dam has broken and that it has been largely swept away. Each side is blaming the other. Ukraine says that Russia blew up the dam, which happened at 2:50 local time earlier today. Kyiv calls it a terrorist attack. Ukraine's energy operator said that the power plant was blown up by an internal explosion. The plant, which dates from 1956, was in Russian hands. But the Kremlin said the explosion was an act of deliberate sabotage by Kyiv to distract from its, quote, faltering offensive, while Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Ukraine breached the dam to prevent Russia from attacking near Kherson. So even on the Russian side, the story is not exactly straight either. Ukraine has dismissed Russia's claims as nonsense. In Europe, Ukraine's account is selling a little bit better. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has blamed Russia for the attack, as did EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell. Now, there's been even speculation from a number of quarters that mismanagement might have actually caused too much water to be pumped into the reservoir, causing the dam to burst. On Twitter, exiled Russian opposition activist Ruslan Leviev said that the water level kept growing because the occupation administration did not know how to regulate the hydroelectric power station. The US science journalist Jeff Broomfield also gives this theory credence, noting that the water levels had been rising dangerously during during May and after plummeting in February. So it could actually be all at one big cock-up, or maybe deliberate negligence on the part of Russia. Now, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba has underlined the actual damage that might have been caused by this. He says that the blowing up of the dam, if it was indeed blown up, was regional ecocide, and that entire ecosystems are being irreversibly harmed. So this is obviously something that will sell quite strongly in the West as well. 150 tons of engine oil have supposedly been released into the Dnieper River, with the potential for a lot more after.
And Oliver, as you say, we don't know exactly why this dam has broken in this way. But I suppose the real question now in the midst of this war is which side benefits from what's happening? Well,
both Ukraine and Russia have accused each other for several months now of planning to blow up the dam. Now, the fact that Russia is in control of it suggests that a Russian operation would be more likely. And certainly the timing, as Ukraine's long-mooted counter-offensive appears to have begun, is noticeable. It would certainly make it harder for Ukraine to advance south, but senior Ukrainian military say that this will not stop them. They've obviously got a plan B because they have foreseen this possibility as well. The fact that Russia still maintains aerial supremacy will make it very, very difficult to advance south towards Crimea if Ukraine decides to do so. But Russian troops will also need to fall back themselves. The flooding will impede their ability to actually shell settlements on the Ukrainian side of the front. The implications for the civilian populations are greater. It'll put a greater strain on Ukraine's possibility or potential to generate energy, which are greatly hampered already by Russian attacks on vital infrastructure, and also the fact that the Zaporizhia power plant is both in Russian hands and offline. And civilians in Russian-occupied areas will themselves be in trouble because they actually won't have drinking water, as we saw in the package there. Crimea actually gets most of its drinking water from the reservoir that was attacked today. So, whether this eventuality has been factored in by whoever was responsible for this, it's something we will probably have to wait at least a few weeks to find out what the actual effects are.
Oliver Farry, thanks very much.
Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Tom Burgess-Wilson. These are our headlines. The breach of a dam in Ukraine causes damage and flooding in an area where tens of thousands of people live. The cause of that breach isn't yet clear. Fresh elections are going to be held in 4 municipalities of northern Kosovo, elections that were boycotted by Kosovo's ethnic Serb minority last time around. And France's unions stage fresh protests and limited strike action to express opposition to government plans to reform the pension system and raise the retirement age. Welcome back. Hundreds of people have had to be evacuated in Ukraine today after water burst through the barrier of what is one of the world's largest dams. Well, the dam and its hydroelectric plant are in Russian-controlled territory about 70 kilometres east of the city of Kherson. Well, these facilities provide electricity, irrigation and drinking water to huge areas of southern Ukraine. It isn't yet clear what caused the breach at the Kakhovka Dam, but Kyiv and Moscow are accusing each other. And NBC News has cited US intelligence sources as saying that Russia was responsible. France 24's Andrew Hillier has more.
Downstream from the Nova Kakhovka Dam, water is rising fast. People still living in towns up and down the Dnieper River have had no choice but to leave their homes.
I was evacuated from Antonivka, which was flooded. Our local school and stadium were flooded. The stadium was completely underwater. The road was also flooded, so the bus got stuck.
A state of emergency has been declared in the district of Nova Kakhovka, where the water level has already risen by more than 10 metres. Some 80 towns and villages are at risk of being flooded. Water has been gushing through the dam ever since it was breached overnight. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russian forces of being behind the blast, saying Moscow was hoping to stop Ukrainian troops from crossing it.
Russia's been controlling the dam and the Kakhovka hydroelectric plant for over a year, and it's impossible to blow it up from the outside by shelling. It was mined by the Russian occupiers, and they blew it up.
Moscow, for its part, has accused Kyiv of deliberately sabotaging the dam. It lies in southern Ukraine, a few dozen kilometers from the city of Kherson, and it's been under Russian control since shortly after Moscow's large-scale invasion in February last year. For months, officials have been warning that the dam could be targeted. It's critical to Ukraine's energy infrastructure, providing electricity to millions of homes and water to communities upstream, as well as to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant.
Meanwhile, lawyers for Ukraine and Russia traded accusations today at the International Court of Justice. The Ukrainian delegation accuses Russia of being a terrorist state and blamed Moscow for downing a Malaysian Airlines passenger plane nearly a decade ago because, Ukraine argues, Russia armed and funded the separatists who are accused of shooting that plane down. France 24's Yinka Oyetade filed this report.
They're not only facing off on the battlefield, but in the court of law too. Russia and Ukraine go head-to-head in The Hague, following up on a case filed by Kyiv in 2017, well before its 2022 full-scale invasion. It accuses Moscow of not only funding and arming pro-Russian separatists, but of orchestrating their insurgency in Ukraine's Donbas region, a conflict which started in 2014, claiming the lives of 13,000 people, and which caused the downing of a Malaysian Airlines flight, killing all 298 passengers and crew on board.
Recall what happened as Russian money and weapons poured in. Flight MH17, Volnovakha, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, Kharkiv. Civilians faced a reign of intimidation and terror. Now Russia brings terror to all the citizens of Ukraine on a national scale. Russia's actions are the actions of a terrorist state, an aggressor.
At the International Court of Justice, it's Ukraine's representative that leads the judicial offensive. A guilty verdict for Moscow would be largely symbolic, as the court doesn't have the means to enforce sentences. Along with accusations of financing terrorism, Russia is also charged with restricting the rights of ethnic Tatars in Crimea. Those allegations are just the start of Moscow's legal woes. Last February, Ukraine filed a separate case accusing Russia of planning a genocide. Judges have also issued an arrest warrant against President Vladimir Putin for suspected war crimes.
Time now for our daily fact-checking segment, Truth or Fake. I'm joined now by Catalina Marchandiebreu. Welcome to the programme, Catalina. Today we're looking at that incident in Ukraine, the dam, the Nova Kakhovka Dam. What's been circulating about that online today?
Ukraine and Russia mutually accuse each other of blowing up the Nova Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine, a military action that triggered catastrophic floods, forcing thousands to flee their homes. We've seen many viral videos online of showing the extent of the damage of these floods, some real, some fake. Let's begin with this viral video that's gathered over 1 million views on Twitter, a video that's in a black and white, posted today following the explosion, where we see in this video, eventually we'll see several explosions that can be seen hitting this dam and a bridge as well, where these users claim that this is the precise moment when Russian occupation forces blew up the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, while others claim that this is the precise moment when we see that Ukrainian armed forces blew up the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine. Tom?
Okay, and do those images actually belong to the dam collapse in Ukraine today?
No, Tom, these images do not belong to today's dam explosion of the Nova Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine. We did a geolocation when we noticed that the destroyed area on this viral video corresponds to the northern part of the dam, while today's explosion took place in the southern part of this dam. If we compare this image from the viral video, screenshot from the viral video, to this image on Google Maps that shows the northern part of the dam, you can see that the image images correspond with the same elements. For example, this electricity pylon that we see on both images, or this metal building that we also see on the viral video that, I repeat, belongs to the northern part of the Nova Kakhovka Dam. Here's more satellite imagery where you could see, or where you could also see this electricity pylon if we zoom in the northern part of the dam, in this part, and today's explosion took place right here. Then, just to be more precise, here's an image up close that shows the damage of today's explosion that took place next to these beige and white buildings in the dam, while the explosion from the viral claims took place right here in this area. Tom.
Okay, so it's the same dam but a different area. So if these images in the video are not from today's explosion, when are they from then?
Well, even though this video did not take place today, it does show an explosion in Ukraine's Nova Kakhovka Dam from November. Reuters and other media reported on this major explosion that took place on November 11th, 2022. And the same viral video was also posted by Russian media, published on November 12th, where we see the same video that we showed earlier, viral on Twitter. And this explosion from November also shown by Maxar US satellite imagery, where you could see this shadow of the electric pylon that we showed earlier on the northern side of the dam from the explosion on November 11th, and not from today's explosion that caused severe damage in this area in southern Ukraine. Here's a verified video of the extent of the damage, where we see entire houses being washed away by the flooding caused by the explosion in the Dnieper River.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that edition of Truth or Fake. Katarina Marcin-Diabreu, thank you very much indeed. Welcome back. Hundreds of people had to be evacuated in Ukraine today after water burst through the barrier of what is one of the world's largest dams. Well, the dam and its hydroelectric plant are in Russian-controlled territory, about 70 kilometers east of the city of Kherson. Well, these facilities provide electricity, irrigation and drinking water to a huge area of southern Ukraine. Well, it isn't yet clear what caused the breach at the Kakhovka Dam, but Kyiv and Moscow are accusing each other. Well, NBC News has cited US intelligence sources as saying that Russia was responsible. France 24's Kyiv correspondent Gulliver Cragg gave us this update.
The Ukrainian authorities are absolutely indignant at the way some international media seem to be, according to them, giving undue credence to Russian claims that Ukraine is responsible for blowing up this dam. And they do have quite a lot of strong arguments. First of all, the context. Would Ukraine really blow up a dam that until yesterday was a hydroelectric power station generating electricity for some 3 million homes in Ukraine at a time when its electricity infrastructure has already been very severely damaged by Russian shelling? Would Ukraine really want to provoke this kind of ecological catastrophe that is currently unfolding? And also, in more concrete terms, how could Ukraine have done it? Ukrainian forces are not present at the Kakhovka Dam. It has been occupied by Russian forces almost since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, I think since the second day. And for the Ukrainians to have blown it up, they would have had to fire a missile from a long distance. Most experts say that would not have been sufficient to blow the dam up. One possibility is that it could have been one of the very strong Storm Shadow missiles that Britain supplied Ukraine with recently. But if Ukraine had fired one of those, then the UK would have found out about it immediately, because they are immediately informed whenever one of these rockets is fired, and this is obviously not something they would have approved of. So Ukraine has very strong arguments for saying it's very clearly not us, and they are convinced that Russia did this deliberately, and they're calling it a war crime. That may very well be the case. There is one other hypothesis, though, that's being advanced, which is that Russia bears responsibility but didn't do it on purpose, if you like. The Russians had been shelling the road on the top of the dam for months. Many times it has been hit by, I think, Ukrainian and Russian shelling. That may have damaged its structure, and that damage may have been compounded by bad Russian management of the dam under Russian occupation, bad water management. It is just possible that the Russians intended to provoke a much smaller explosion than what they did, and they didn't actually mean to send these floodwaters gushing forth. But even in that analysis, it's still very clearly the Russians' fault.
France 24's Kyiv correspondent Gulliver Cragg speaking to us a little earlier.
A major dam in Ukraine has been destroyed. The consequences of this act are still being assessed, but it's already clear that many homes will be lost, even lives put at risk. Each side is blaming the other, but with Ukrainian lives and homes at risk, Ukraine's president spoke out to condemn what he called Russian terrorism. Volodymyr Zelensky wasted no time condemning Moscow's role. Over 17,000 Ukrainians have been moved to safety, but the extent of the damage is still being assessed. In the town of Nova Kakhovka, water levels have risen by a reported 11 metres already. The Nova Kakhovka Dam was part of a hydroelectric network that provided power to Ukraine and Crimea in particular. With Russia blaming Ukraine, Ukraine blaming Russia, the United States is somewhat diplomatically sitting on the fence, saying they hope for more conclusive evidence in the coming days. We'll hear at France 24, Andrew Hillier with this.
Downstream from the Nova Kakhovka Dam, water is rising fast. People still living in towns up and down the Dnieper River have had no choice but to leave their homes.
I was evacuated from Antonivka, which was flooded. Our local school and stadium were flooded. The stadium was completely underwater. The road was also flooded, so the bus got stuck.
A state of emergency has been declared in the district of Nova Kakhovka, where the water level has already risen by more than 10 metres. Some 80 towns and villages are at risk of being flooded. Water has been gushing through the dam ever since it was breached overnight. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russian forces of being behind the blast, saying Moscow was hoping to stop Ukrainian troops from crossing it.
Russia's been controlling the dam and the Kakhovka hydroelectric plants for over a year, and it's impossible to blow it up from the outside by shelling. It was mined by the Russian occupiers, and they blew it up.
Moscow, for its part, has accused Kyiv of deliberately sabotaging the dam. It lies in southern Ukraine, a few dozen kilometers from the city of Kherson, and it's been under Russian control since shortly after Moscow's large-scale invasion in February last year. For months, officials have been warning that the dam could be targeted. It's critical to Ukraine's energy infrastructure, providing electricity to millions of homes and water to communities upstream, as well as to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant.
Andrew Hillier with that. Let's bring in for analysis Samuel Romani from the Royal United Services Institute. Samuel, good evening to you. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you straight. Who do you think did this, Russia or Ukraine?
Well, I think that the evidence is overwhelming that it's probably Russia. It seems to be coming through, obviously, from U.S. intelligence documents that have been given to NBC News, for example, and the statements from most NATO ministers need to reflect this. Also, it's important to keep in mind that the Russians have basically launched a false flag about Ukraine and their responsibility for this dam back as early as last summer. So the Russians have been preparing for this for quite a long time.
Samuel, what are the consequences of this breach, both in terms of on the ground for people concerned in the area, but also militarily?
So I would say that the consequences for people on the ground is very, very tragic. Obviously, it's going to lead to a mass displacement of people. I've already seen that happen in Kherson. But when you're looking at the military dynamics, I don't think it's going to have that much of an immediate negative effect on the counteroffensive, because the primary axes of the Ukrainian counteroffensive are in South Donetsk, the outskirts of Bakhmut, Barkivka, for example, and also along the Zaporizhzhia axis to Melitopol. Kherson and the other side of it, the Dnieper River, is a secondary axis at best. So I think it's much worse for the local population than it is for the Ukrainian military.
Samuel, we heard in our report Volodymyr Zelensky talking about how important the dam is and saying that this could not have been done from outside. It had to be an inside job, i.e. the Russians. Why is this dam so strategically important?
Well, the dam is strategically important because of its location, right? It's obviously in close proximity, not just to Kherson, but also to some of the crucial nuclear plants. And obviously, so far we've seen evidence in the IAEA that the detonation of the dam has not threatened the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, but it's very clear that any kind of detonation here could have had massive reverberations for southern Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So that's probably what he's referring to. It's of great economic importance and also risks nuclear Armageddon if this would have spiraled even more out of control.
How do you interpret this from Russia's perspective, in the sense that what is this telling us about Russia's state of mind at this present moment of time? What does this attack tell us about Russia's command?
Well, basically what it's showing is that Russia's got very limited means to be able to escalate against the Ukrainians conventionally. And we've seen that with their threats to bomb decision-making centers in Kiev, only to find that the vast majority of their missiles and their drones keep getting intercepted by the Neo-class air defenses. So they have very few conventional options, and one of the only things they can do is cause a massive disturbance like this by attacking the Nova Kakhovka Dam. I think we should interpret it as a sign of Russia's conventional military weakness and not a show of strength or a power play for Moscow.
Samuel Ramadi from the Royal United Services Institute, thank you very much indeed for joining us here in France 24. We appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ukraine on Tuesday called Russia a terrorist state at the top UN court as hearings began in a case of Moscow's backing of pro-Russian separatists blamed for shooting down the Malaysian Airways flight MH17 in 2014. A former colleague of mine was on board that flight. Glenn Thomas was working for the United Nations at the time. The case in The Hague was the first time lawyers for Ukraine and Russia met at the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, since Moscow launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022. Legal teams with dozens of representatives were sent by each side. A panel of 16 judges at the ICJ began hearing Ukraine's claim that Moscow violated the UN anti-terrorism treaty by equipping and funding pro-Russian forces who shot down the jetliner, killing all 298 passengers and crew.
Harsh words from the Ukrainian ambassador at the opening of this trial at the International Court of Justice between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine calling Russia a terrorist state and saying that the 2014 annexation of Crimea was a harbinger of the total war that was to come. Now, lawyers here outlined how Russia provided both funds and weapons to rebel groups in eastern Ukraine in violation of the treaty on the financing of terrorism. Those weapons were used to shell civilians, but also that Buck missile that was provided was used to shoot down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 back in July 2014, killing all 298 people on board. Now, that is something that Ukraine has been trying to hold Russia accountable for in other places as well. A Dutch court convicted 2 Russians and a Ukrainian about that last year. And they're hoping to get that acknowledged here at the ICJ as well. The other charge concerns the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. That's about the Tatar minority who are no longer allowed to meet. The Ukrainian language was banned in Crimea and Ukrainian culture wiped from the streets, the Ukrainian ambassador said, again in a harbinger of what would follow after the Ukrainian invasion. Now, Russia will get its chance to reply on Thursday, and then there'll be another 2 days of hearings next week before judges deliberate, and we hope to have a verdict before the end of the year, but it could be much longer than that.
Fernand Van Tetz, our reporter.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on France 24. Well, a humanitarian disaster is unfolding in southern Ukraine following the destruction of a dam along the Dnieper River. Tens of thousands of people have been evacuated, and floodwaters have covered dozens of villages downstream. On Tuesday, the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed in an area controlled by the Russians. Kyiv is laying the blame on Moscow, while the Kremlin is calling the blast an act of Ukrainian sabotage. In the meantime, Russian officials have declared a state of emergency in parts of the Kherson region that are under their control. We get the latest from our Kyiv correspondent, Gulliver Craig, reporting from Mykolaiv.
At least 35 villages and towns have been flooded on both sides of the river. So that's on the Ukrainian-held northwestern side and the Russian-held southeastern side. On the Ukrainian side, there has been an evacuation plan, but these are areas that were already on the front line and being shelled quite regularly. So a lot of people had already left these areas, and those who stayed, I think, often very stubborn people who are determined to stay in their homes no matter what, and some of them have decided to stick it out. It's expected that the high water will last for several days, but within a week it will have gone down again. And so that's the situation for the moment. What we're hearing from the Russian-held bank of the river is that there is no real evacuation plan in place. Pictures are coming out of there, particularly from the town of Oleshki, of people just sitting on their roofs as the flood waters flow by. I've also seen a video of a roof itself clearly having been washed off its house by the waters and floating down the river. There's also been a tragedy in Nova Kakhovka, which is right by the dam, a town occupied by Russian forces, where there is, or I should probably say now was, a very big zoo, one of the biggest in Ukraine, and they are reporting that some 300 animals have died, including monkeys, raccoons, donkeys. Only the ducks and swans survived, they said.
And that's our Kyiv correspondent Gulliver Craig reporting. Now, in reaction to the crisis, the UN Security Council widely condemned the destruction of the dam. Ukraine's allies are demanding that Russia be held accountable without directly blaming Moscow. Fraser Jackson has more on the international reaction to the disaster.
As Ukraine and Russia trade blame for the Kakhovka Dam collapse, the international community has been weighing in on the looming environmental disaster. Kyiv's biggest backer, the US, is actively reviewing intelligence as to the cause of the catastrophe, but so far it said it wasn't certain.
We have seen the reports that Russia was responsible for the explosion at the dam, which Russian forces took illegally last year, and we have been continuing to monitor. We can't say conclusively what happened at this point, but we will share more information when we can.
Across the border in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also wasn't pointing any fingers prematurely.
This is yet another example of the horrific consequences of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Some leaders, however, were more sure of who was to blame. Lithuania shares a border with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Its president said such events raise questions over the limits of common sense.
You start to wonder, perhaps there aren't any taboos when it comes to blackmail over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plants that Russia seeks to use against all civilized worlds. These are the war crimes and the crimes of aggression.
Meanwhile, the chief of the UN said the collapse was another devastating consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Today's tragedy is yet another example of the horrific price of war on people. The floodgates of suffering have been overflowing for more than a year, and that must stop. Attacks against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure must stop.
The UN's Atomic Energy Agency said the cooling pond for the nearby Zaporizhzhia power plant has enough water for months, but that the bursting of the dam is making an already difficult and unpredictable security situation even more so.
That's Fraser Jackson reporting. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on France 24. A humanitarian disaster is unfolding in southern Ukraine following the destruction of a dam along the Dnieper River. Tens of thousands of people have been evacuated, and floodwaters have covered dozens of villages downstream. On Tuesday, the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed in an area controlled by the Russians. Kyiv is laying the blame on Moscow, while the Kremlin is calling the blast an act of Ukrainian sabotage. Veronica Bahel has the latest.
Downstream from the Nova Kakhovka Dam, water is rising fast, leaving hundreds living along the Dnieper River with no choice but to leave their homes. As authorities warn that the worst floodwater levels are yet to come, villagers anxiously wait to be evacuated.
I am afraid my house will be completely submerged, and it's made of clay. I can't help stressing, and my asthma's got worse.
I was brought here so I can get to Kablevo. My daughter and grandchildren also were evacuated too.
Some 80 towns and villages are at risk of being flooded, and in the district of Nova Kakhovka, a state of emergency has been declared. Water has been gushing through the barrier ever since it was breached on Tuesday, and Ukraine's president accused Moscow of causing the disaster.
The whole world will know about this Russian war crime, the crime of ecocide. This deliberate destruction of the dam and other facilities by the Russian occupiers is an environmental bomb of mass destruction. For the sake of their own security, the world should now show that Russia will not get away with such terror.
Russia, however, counterblamed Ukraine of deliberately sabotaging it via shelling. The critical dam lies in the southern city of Kherson, which has been under Russian control for most of the invasion. Officials have warned for months that the dam could be targeted, as it's integral to Ukraine's energy infrastructure, providing millions with electricity and water to communities upstream.
Now, in reaction to the crisis, the UN Security Council widely condemned the destruction of the dam. Ukraine's allies are demanding that Russia be held accountable without directly blaming Moscow. We get that part of the story from our correspondent in New York, Jessica Lemesurier.
The United States is not certain who's to blame for this burst dam in Ukraine, but it would not make sense for Ukraine to have done this to its own people and territory. That's what the deputy US ambassador to the UN, Robert Wood, had to say at Tuesday's UN Security Council meeting. The United Nations relief chief, Martin Griffiths, told council members that the UN has no independent access to actually assess how the dam was damaged. But he added that 40 settlements have already been flooded and that electricity generation's been impacted. He said that the UN's trying to gauge the situation now in Kherson. He said there's also concern about the safety of Zaporizhzhia power plant, and diplomats called on parties to ensure the safety of nuclear facilities. Well, Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia blamed Ukraine. He said that it was deliberate sabotage and a war crime. But Ukraine's ambassador Sergei Kyslytsya said, well, this is just another case of Russia blaming the victim for its own crimes, lying once again in the Security Council, and he called this an act of ecological terrorism. The UK's representative said that this was just the latest of the many tragic consequences of Putin's war, and added that if it is proven that Russia was responsible, then this will be a whole new low. The flooding now threatens to contaminate water supplies and impact food production in Ukraine. France's ambassador Nicolas de Rivière said that, well, this would never have happened if Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine. Earlier on in the day, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that the floodgates of suffering have already been overflowing for over a year, and that must stop.
That's our correspondent in New York, Jessica Lemesurier, reporting. In the meantime, Russian officials have declared a state of emergency in parts of the Kherson region that are under their control. Jenny Shin has more on the possible consequences of the dam's collapse for the region.
The Nova Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine lies some 30 kilometers east of Kherson. It crosses Ukraine's mighty Dnieper River and held 18 cubic kilometers of water within its 30-meter wall. Its destruction spells out huge consequences for the wider region, starting with towns downstream. Water levels are set to continue to rise for the next 3 to 10 days. Thousands of wild animals have died, and hundreds of thousands of residents remain trapped without normal access to drinking water, with risk of contamination. The breach is an ecological catastrophe with far-reaching consequences for the environment, notably for the marine life that depends on the reservoir. This video, posted by a Ukrainian official, claims to show stranded fish in the Dnipro floodwaters. In addition to the flooding, Kyiv says at least 150 tons of oil has been spilled into the river, causing an estimated 50 million euros of damage. Also at risk is Crimea's canal irrigation system. The North Crimea Canal delivers water to Crimea from the Dnieper River and accounts for some 80% of Crimea's water. The dam's destruction could wreck the system of canals, threatening 120,000 hectares of crops which rely on irrigation. Further upstream lies the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Water from the reservoir behind the Nova Kakhovka Dam is needed for the plant's cooling systems. The International Atomic Energy Agency says it's monitoring the situation, but that there are no immediate safety risks.
That was Jenny Shin reporting.
Our top story today, floodwaters from the collapsed Kakhovka Dam are still rising in southern Ukraine this Wednesday. Amid warnings, its impact could be felt for generations. In the short term, over 40,000 people are at immediate risk of flooding downstream of the dam. Evacuations on both the Ukrainian and the Russian-controlled side of the Dnieper River are reported to be underway, and Kyiv says it's urgently trying to provide drinking water to the affected areas. This Wednesday, it remains unclear what caused the dam's collapse, with Ukraine and Russia saying the other had attacked it. Jenny Shin has this.
The Nova Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine lies some 30 kilometers east of Kherson. It crosses Ukraine's mighty Dnieper River and held 18 cubic kilometers of water within its 30-meter wall. Its destruction spells out huge consequences for the wider region, starting with towns downstream. Water levels are set to continue to rise for the next 3 to 10 days. Thousands of wild animals have died, and hundreds of thousands of residents remain trapped without normal access to drinking water, with risk of contamination. The breach is an ecological catastrophe with far-reaching consequences for the environment, notably for the marine life that depends on the reservoir. This video, posted by a Ukrainian official, claims to show stranded fish in the Dnipro floodwaters. In addition to the flooding, Kyiv says at least 150 tons of oil has been spilled into the river, causing an estimated 50 million euros of damage. Also at risk is Crimea's canal irrigation system. The North Crimea Canal delivers water to Crimea from the Dnieper River and accounts for some 80% of Crimea's water. The dam's destruction could wreck the system of canals, threatening 120,000 hectares of crops which rely on irrigation. Further upstream lies the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Water from the reservoir behind the Nova Kakhovka Dam is needed for the plant's cooling systems. The International Atomic Energy Agency says it's monitoring the situation, but that there are no immediate safety risks.
Well, to talk a bit more about the destruction of the dam and how it may now affect Ukraine's military strategy, I'm pleased to be joined on the programme live from Kyiv by Yuri Sak, who's an advisor to Ukraine's Ministry of Defence. Welcome to the programme, sir. Thanks for talking to us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
Moscow is pointing the finger squarely at Ukraine for the destruction of this dam, calling it an act of sabotage. What's your response to that?
It's lies and propaganda. It's the same pack of lies they've used when they were claiming that it was not them who shot down the Malaysian MH17 Boeing in 2014. It is the same pack of lies they've used when they said that in Bucha, where they've committed massive mass murder and atrocities of unseen scale, they said that it was us who actually staged the massacre in Bucha. And they've been lying every day. Like, look, yesterday they were distributing a video on Russian social media about apparently the destruction by the Russian forces of the first Leopard tank. Now, look, this was a harvester combiner. And so what I'm trying to say is that trusting Russia is futile. They lie on a daily basis. Plus, our president said it very clearly. It was not just possible, logically, for Ukrainian side to do anything with this dam because it was blown up from inside, and it was under Russia's control for the last half a year. So, and we have intelligence that the Russian terrorists have been taking explosive and preparing for this for quite some time. So deep inside, they know now and they knew long before that Ukraine will come after them, that Ukraine will be winning this war. This is why, as an act of desperation, they've resorted to this terrorist attack. And this just underscores, why the international community has to stand with Ukraine, because we are dealing with a deranged, debased terrorist regime.
Right, but if I may, there are questions about why Russia would attack the dam, given that it has now been forced to evacuate its own troops, evacuate civilians, and the flooding could affect water supplies in Crimea. So it doesn't look in one way that this is in Russia's interest, does it?
These are the narratives that the Russian propaganda is planting in the Western audiences as well. But I have just answered your question very, very clearly and simply. Russia is losing on the battlefield. Russia is in panic. The terrorist regime is falling apart. They are suffering setbacks on the battlefields in Ukraine. They have a civil war uprising beginning inside Russia. So they are in chaos. They are in panic. They are paranoid. This is why they're using these terrorist tactics.
All right, your message is very clear. And if we do take your view then that it was Russia that blew up this dam, the timing seems to be rather interesting, doesn't it, when we've been talking about that Ukrainian counter-offensive that could begin at any time. It could be in this very region that is now flooded. Do you think this was a deliberate decision to explode the dam now and delay your counteroffensive?
Well, we are almost confident that this was what they were hoping for. They were scared. Like I said, they're in panic, and they are thinking that by blowing out the dam, they are so debased and deranged that they have even flooded their own defense lines. We have video footage of Russian soldiers trying to evacuate from the flooded regions by inflatable boats. So, of course, they wanted to delay or somehow influence our military plans. Now, they have failed because they will have no impact whatsoever on what we have planned.
It won't have any impact on what you're planning to do, you say, but
No.
It has been suggested, for example, that it would be harder now for the Ukrainian army to carry out assault crossings on the Dnieper River. Is that true?
Let me just tell you that the Ukrainian front line, unfortunately, is now more than 900 kilometers. And this is just the active front line, right? So trust me, there are other places where we can conduct successful military operations. This is why it's another miscalculation by these terrorists. They're just, in addition to being demoralized and degraded, they seem also a little bit stupid, to be honest.
Well, can you tell us then a bit more about perhaps not exactly how this counteroffensive of Ukraine's will unfold, but the timing of this? It was reported earlier this week that your deputy Minister of Defense had said Ukraine was moving to offensive operations. Does that mean the counteroffensive has begun?
Well, we do not disclose any specific plans, as you understand, because the element of surprise is part of the military strategy. And of course, we understand how everybody wants to know, when the counteroffensive will begin. But look, what we've said many times, first of all, plans love quiet and silence. Second of all, counteroffensive or offensive in our case, it's not just one event that has a beginning at a shot of a signal gun. Right? It's a series of different complexity military operations. Some of them have been already taking place, shaping operations, probing operations, some counter-attacking operations in certain parts of the front line. So it is a mistake to sit back and think that we will be watching like a Netflix kind of battle scene from Game of Thrones, Battle of Bastards. It's not going to be like that. It's much more subtle. We are fighting a smart war. We understand that, we are standing up against a very large and brutal enemy, so we have to outsmart them. This is exactly what we want. We want them to be nervous. We want them to be losing sleep, and they are already paranoid because they have no idea what is coming next and where it will come from.
Yeah, and you say strategically the flooding of this part of southern Ukraine hasn't affected you on the battlefield, but in terms of morale, is this affecting Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians?
Well, absolutely. It has a huge impact on the morale of our soldiers because it makes us even more angry and it makes us even more determined to continue our fight, to continue liberating our land and to continue punishing these war criminals and terrorists. And this is exactly what is coming their way.
Yuri Sak.
They just make us more angry.
Your message is heard loud and clear. Thank you very much indeed. That's Yuri Sak, an advisor to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Our top story, floodwaters from the collapsed Kakhovka Dam are still rising in southern Ukraine this Wednesday. Amid warnings, its impact could be felt for generations. In the short term, over 40,000 people are at immediate risk from flooding downstream of the dam. Evacuations from both the Ukrainian and the Russian-controlled side of the Dnieper River are underway, and Kyiv says it's urgently trying to provide drinking water to the affected areas. Now, this Wednesday, it still remains unclear what caused the dam's collapse, with Ukraine and Russia saying each other had attacked it. Well, let's talk now to our Ukraine correspondent, Gulliver Cragg, who visited the flood-affected region today. He joins me right now. Gulliver, you were in Kherson a short while ago. Just tell us what you saw.
Well, part of Kherson city is underwater, and I saw petrol stations which the petrol pumps were not visible because the water was above that level. People who I spoke to who'd just been evacuated from areas further away said that their houses were flooded right up to the roof, that they'd been sitting on the roof. The evacuation operation is underway using speedboats, rowing boats. We actually saw on the road in between Mykolaiv and Kherson boats being driven on trailers, clearly to join in the effort there to help with evacuating people and also animals. There was a lot of evacuation of pets going on when I was there. They're also using at least 2 of these very impressive amphibious vehicles that have wheels but also float on the water. That's in Kherson City. We were there accompanied by the Deputy Infrastructure Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of reconstruction, who were talking about the vast sums that the government has already decided to allocate to rebuilding the infrastructure for supplying areas that depended on the Kakhovka reservoir with water, because it's already clear that this dam cannot be rebuilt anytime soon. Alternative ways of supplying even big cities like Kryvyi Rih, which has 700,000 inhabitants, with water will have to be found and built very, very quickly.
Gulliver Cragg, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's talk a bit more then about the dam and what may happen now with Scott Lucas. He's a professor of international politics at University College Dublin. Welcome to the programme, sir. Thank you for joining us. I wonder, first of all, who you think benefits from the collapse of this dam?
First of all, let's put out a few facts about what we know about the explosion, which could point to who might have carried it out. 600 meters of a 2-kilometer wide dam collapsed. That's a very, very large section. And I've talked to a lot of folks in the last 24 hours, experts in munitions, experts in engineering, and shelling would not have caused that large a collapse. Indeed, bombing, aerial bombing, probably wouldn't have caused it, because it would require hundreds of pounds of explosives. So the most likely cause at this point of the collapse are explosives that were placed on the dam. And there's only one party that's in a position to do that. And that is, of course, the Russians. Now, why would the Russians want to destroy this dam, causing the destruction, threatening civilians, threatening environmental damage for decades? It's quite simply because Ukraine is in the preparatory steps of a counteroffensive that would not only be in eastern Ukraine, where they have advanced earlier this week, but in southern Ukraine. And to hold up a Ukrainian offensive, to hold up their movement of armored vehicles, for example, you flood the area. You let the Dnieper River overrun its banks, which is precisely what has happened in the last 24 hours.
And if that analysis is correct, that this was a deliberate act by Russia, I wonder if you think it actually might backfire, given that we're seeing these reports that Russia too has to evacuate civilians, it too has to evacuate its soldiers, and this could impact the water supply in Crimea, which of course Russia controls.
Well, I'm not sure those calculations came into play. And I'll explain, first of all, that we've got videos which are coming in from the the left eastern bank of the river, which is the Russian occupied bank. And there are no rescue efforts in areas like Aletsky or even in Nova Kakhovka. There are people who are stranded in their houses. So it doesn't appear that the Russians had planned for an evacuation or are implementing it very quickly. Troops are scrambling from the front lines to get to higher ground. What I think happened, and I must emphasize I cannot prove this, we don't have conclusive evidence yet, is that if Russia did demolish this dam, it was done pretty quickly. It was done on orders which came either from the Kremlin or for senior military commanders who quite simply are at the point of almost panicking in terms of being desperate in the face of what is going to be this Ukrainian counteroffensive and feeling that they are in a very, very poor position to defend themselves on the battleground.
A bit earlier this afternoon, I spoke to an advisor to the defense ministry in Ukraine, and he was adamant that this wouldn't impact the Ukrainian counteroffensive at all. It wouldn't delay that planned assault. Do you think that that's true?
It depends on how they're going to carry out the assault. I mean, it is not possible now to move heavy armored vehicles, large military vehicles across that portion of the Dnipro that is flooded in the Kherson region. You can move lighter vehicles across, but that might not be enough for a counteroffensive. If you're going to move heavy vehicles across, you need to go upstream, higher up the Dnieper River, up near the city of Dnipro itself. Now, the Ukrainians may have planned for that, or alternative, let's remember that the Ukrainians may be planning to launch the initial wave of their counteroffensive not in the south, but in the east of Ukraine, which of course is distant from the flooding that we're talking about.
And just finally, I wonder if you think that there are risks now to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, given that the dam that has now collapsed provides cooling water to that site.
Well, the Ukrainian Nuclear Authority and the International Atomic Energy Agency say there is no imminent threat to the cooling pond at the nuclear plant. The water in that cooling pond is still at 16.6 meters, which is its normal level. Now there will be evaporation from that pond, which normally would be refilled with water from the reservoir, from the Nova Kakhovka Dam. But the IEA has said that that water can be provided from alternative sources, such as underground sources. So at this point, while we're looking at all the many levels of disaster that we have here, an immediate crisis at the nuclear plant is not one of them.
Professor Scott Lucas, thank you very much.